The number one question I get every time I talk to somebody. Everybody wants to know, like, should I use Backstage or should I build something or do whatever?
Hello, folks, and welcome to HangarDX podcast. This is a podcast about developer experience and how engineering teams solve productivity challenges at scale. I'm your host, Ankit Jain, co-founder of Aviator. At Aviator, we build developer experience platform, including Runbooks, which is our multiplayer AI coding platform that helps you share your prompts with other people in your team. Today, my guest is Ajay, joining in with bringing in a lot of experience from platform engineering, and that's what we will be diving into today's conversation. Jay, thank you so much for making time for us. I would love for you to introduce yourself briefly for our audience.
Thank you, Ankit. Nice to be here. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Platformetrics, where we try and break down that barriers for organizations across all the industry domains to see like how can they achieve their business goals better. And we actually use a platform-centric approach, right? So there's nothing fancy about achieving those business goals. Everybody wants it, but the idea is how do you actually apply platform principles to do that? So I do it through like multiple ways, and mostly I speak with CEOs and CXOs to provide them advice and the direction, things like that. But I also provide a lot of enablement activities, and which I'm happy to talk about today. But as well as we build some solutions. So our solutions are starting up right now, and I've been doing this for just a few months. So we're building some really interesting solutions that can actually help people solve those problems. So that's who I am.
Very cool. So, Ajay, probably you're one of the people who has the most experience with platform engineering. And I know platform engineering as a concept has now existed maybe like 10 years now. I don't know at what point it got introduced. Obviously, it was sort of like an evolution from also DevOps and everything. You wrote a book about effective platform engineering. Maybe we start from there, right? What was your thought process? Maybe if you can kind of like give a little bit of color to people about some of the things that you try to cover in effective platform engineering book.
A great place to start off, Ankit. So you rightly pointed out that I've been doing this for way too long, right? If I stopped counting, right? So at least for the 30 of the all the years I've been working on, I've been actually working on what I call as improving the developer experience. We used to call it by different names, right? I mean, in the 90s and all that, but still the same thing, right? So we're really trying to say, how do we actually make sure that developers can do their job better? So that was the context in which I've been actually doing this for at a few different places. One of the places I did this was ThoughtWorks, and I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with ThoughtWorks. So at ThoughtWorks, I set up the whole platform engineering team several years back. As part of doing it, one thing that we came to realize was that there is this lack of understanding and the definition. This was, like you said, around 10 years back or something like that. Lack of understanding of like what exactly is platform engineering. And if you really ask me, like, do you have that misunderstanding today? Yes, absolutely. The industry is completely with those kinds of misunderstandings, right? So what we decided to do there was first define platform engineering, because as thought workers, when we say something and people listen to it, right? So we started defining that. Our definition of engineering platform was like, yeah, here's a system that can bring together the infrastructure, governance, operational technologies, and all those things, so that your development teams can actually use it and make things better. And the platform engineering is sort of that craft that produces those engineering platforms, right? So I think that was the whole idea in which we looked at it. But then this question came up, and I'm sure this happens to all the people who are talking about this, like, oh, is this replacing DevOps, or is this actually going to be a new name for something else, or has platform engineering already sailed, and is DevX the new thing, right? So that was a context in which we thought, hey, this is important for us to really write this down. So I actually got a few of my colleagues there, much smarter than me, like four of us got together and we decided to write a book. And the collective experience of the people who actually wrote the book is about 100 years of total experience building this, right? So what we did was we first took this idea of like, let's first make sure that your foundations are right. So foundations being like, we wanted to ensure that DevOps is that culture paradigm. We keep talking about that, as being that culture paradigm, not being a title and team and all that a lot. But what does it really mean, right? So that's where we started from. So if you look at DevOps as that culture paradigm, that culture is enabled by a set of capabilities that we spoke about. So those capabilities are those platform engineering capabilities. Similarly, right, developer experience being that experience for your developers to sort of interact with these tools and frameworks and processes, across the whole SDLC. So if you have to improve that developer experience, that requires a set of capabilities too, and that is platform engineering. And similarly, on the SRE side of things, people talk about applying all those software engineering principles to production, and Google sort of did that phenomenally well. But I haven't seen a lot of other people do it as well as they do. I mean, they do whatever they do and call it SRE. But if you were to just look at it from that point of view, SRE is also from in the production side of things. You also need that level of support to be able to do this. That's where those platform capabilities come in. So to me, it is that central piece that sits in the middle of everything. So when we started writing the book, one of the challenges that we saw was that while there are a few books and platforms that's been out there, some really good books, none of it sort of tackled this product side of things and the engineering side of things to build it. If I were a new person coming in to really try to build an engineering platform, how do you actually go about doing that? So that's what I've sort of tackled in that book, and I hope your listeners give it a read, because the early feedback has been phenomenal, and we are really looking forward to getting more feedback.
Amazing. And we will also link the book in the show notes so people can find it. So this is interesting, right? So you mentioned platform engineering, if I understand it correctly, as a set of capabilities that an software organization should have, right? And many people correlate platform engineering with sort of like a software, right? Like for instance, Spotify launched Backstage, which became popular, and this became sort of like, I would say, the foundational stone of platform engineering, where people say, oh, we use Blackstage, so we have a platform, and this is kind of like how we are using platform effectively. What is your thought on this? Like, capabilities versus software. Like, is somebody using Backstage, or like kind of like another similar, I'll just call it IDP also as a category, um, are they using platform engineering effectively, or is there some capabilities, some different ways to think about the maturity, I guess, in some ways, of platform engineering in an organization?
I mean, this is an excellent question, and probably the one of the key ones we need to tackle, right? So the short answer to that is, thinking of Backstage as your platform is fundamentally wrong. That is just not the way you should be thinking about it, right? And you'll probably find that I'm going to be extremely opinionated in my thinking here, because that's the way I would like to get those points across, right? I'll tell you why that is wrong. Um, Even this terminology of IDPs is misused so much by even people I respect a lot, right? People tend to use IDPs as internal developer portals, and then so, after 5 minutes later, they would say internal developer platform. Now, let's actually get the terminology right, right? Developer Backstage is a framework for a developer portal. Backstage is not even a developer portal; it's just a framework. It's a great framework, but it's a framework for developer portals. But developer portal has a role in your IDP world, in your engineering platform world. So to do that, let me actually take a step back, and this is something that we're discussing a lot in the book. Let me sort of set the stage for what's the scope of platform engineering. I think that's one of the fundamental mistakes that a lot of people make when we really start talking about platform engineering as an abstract concept, and that therein lies the real problem. So to me, there is like seven different components of engineering platform. And the first two are probably the most foundational and simple, and that I don't think we need to go a lot into it. It's basically the networking and the security side of things. Those two planes. If you can't understand the networking as to how some things work, whether it is in a cloud native way or otherwise, you're definitely not going to build your products right these days. Similarly, on the security side of things, the security requirements are no longer and should be an afterthought. It has to be those foundational layers. So if you take those two things aside and say that that's a given, let me just keep it aside. Now let's look at the other five. The next one is something that we talk about all the time today, that is sort of synonymous with platform engineering, is Kubernetes or runtime and Docker and all that, right? Sure, let's call that as a runtime plane, right? Let's look at that like the runtime plane where you're actually going to do all of that. Now comes this whole idea of what I call as the governance and the compliance plane. And the reason I talk about governance and compliance and not really talk about a CI/CD, because that's the first thing that comes to mind when people talk about platform engineering. Oh, CI/CD pipelines. Let's actually get that in there. I'm sorry. Again, I'm going to be very opinionated in saying that CI/CD and pipelines are owned by developers. It is not a platform engineering component. But what platform engineering should do is to ensure that you can actually run your pipelines better. You can actually run that with the right kind of NFR, so that you are actually having the right kind of compliance and governance in it. So that is that next plane. So then comes, so if you look at all of these things sort of like, and we have that laid out in the book, and all those things laid out as like horizontal planes, one on top is where we just started the conversation from. We have your IDEs and developer portals, and essentially your GitHub repos, all the things that the developers interact with. That is sort of the developer plane. So to answer your question, yes, Backstage, the framework, the developer portal would sort of fit into that. Whereas your IDPs or internal developer platforms are sort of the back end of it. So that's the simplest way to understand. You have your front end and back end. Your things like Backstage could be front end. No, the IDPs could be the back end. Now, as you're trying to do the orchestration, you're going to really run into lots of really interesting challenges. And now we see that many vendors are really starting to sort of bridge those gaps, right? I mean, so and I don't want to call out any specific vendors, but I'm happy to provide details around that. There are some vendors who are really trying to bridge that gap and saying that, yeah, hey, here is something that is more closer to what you might really call as an internal developer platform with a front end, and that is what Backstage has been misunderstood as by a lot of people. So this is the reason why people tend to buy Backstage or use an OSS version of a Backstage and say that, hey, here's my platform solution. It is not, right? So just to complete this thought, right? So I talked about the 5 planes. The 2 other planes, those are to me the most important parts of platforms, Dane, that sort of differentiates the platform from whatever we have been doing for all these years, 30 years, 40 years, right? Uh, One is that observability side of things. When we talk about observability, most cases, we tend to think of observability as this two-plane thing, right? Yeah, my application observability and my infrastructure observability. But there is something far more than that, right? I mean, so you have to really look at observability across all the different planes, primarily from the point of view of like, is that really trying to get me the right kind of business outcomes? And how am I actually tying my business outcomes to everything that I'm doing before? Then comes that final plane, which is that true differentiator, which is the platform as a product idea. Right? How do you actually look at platforms as products with a complete life cycle, with the analytics that go along with it, and ensuring that you are building what your users want, not your developers want, what your users want. If you don't have that mindset, you're never really going to get platform right. So as you sort of, as you're listening to this, one thing that I'm really trying to make the differentiation is that, yeah, Backstage and the developer experience to actually a developer portal to that experience is one of the components, but it is not what's going to make the real difference there.
Very interesting. So you covered a lot of like different verticals in a way to kind of like really understand the broader picture of platform engineering. Are there some ways in which these organization leaders can understand the maturity of platform that they have? Like, I mean, obviously, like, these days it's common to have platform teams within the organization, engineering organizations, but like, how do we measure success for them?
Yeah, okay, another great question. So I think the other disservice that has happened is that, I mean, all of us are big fans of Dora, right? I mean, so we are all talking about Dora. Some people talk about Dora even without really understanding what it is. I'll give you a funny example, right? I was actually helping a company a few years back, and the CTO came out and said that I need all the teams to actually come out with your Dora metrics, right? Federate the Dora metrics activities. And then he said that, hey, operations team, you need to come up with your Dora metrics too. And the operations team leader comes to me and said that, what does that mean really? I said, yeah, I don't know what that means, right? So sometimes we actually take some of these great ideas and mess it up. And that's to some extent, that's what has happened with Dora, right? So with the advent of space and a lot of the other metrics and things like that, that has become far more easier to understand and easier to address. But to specifically see how do you actually see the right kind of ROI, there are multiple components that goes into it. So fundamentally, let's talk about a few key principles, right? Um, what are those transformational patterns that make your traditional automation, traditional ways of doing things? Because ever since we started building software, whenever, right, we have been trying to improve things and we have been trying to do things better. We, the current generation of people, haven't really invented anything new in my mind. Right? We have been doing all these things for all long. But there are 4 principles, right? One is like golden paths, right? Have those paved paths, ensuring that you have the right kind of standardization there with the right kind of escape hatches, right? You don't want to create golden cages, but create the golden paths with escape hatches. That's a fun. So that's where you standardize things. Second part is that orchestration thing. This is that brain behind platform engineering, right? The control planes. Your developer has an intent. How do you translate that intent to the infrastructure, activities that actually make sure that you actually build something? The third one is that contextualization. And this is where, and I would love to get into this topic a little bit later. So, what I've been working on is more of this idea of domain driven platform engineering kind of thing. So, this is the contextualization is the place where can you, as a developer who's actually a financial services developer or a healthcare developer doing my product activities, can I actually interact with the system through my domain APIs as opposed to having to go figure out my Terraform for something else or or my Kubernetes for something else. As a developer, I don't need to know all of those things. I can know it and I'm capable of knowing it, but I don't need to and I don't have to because I got better things to worry about. So can you actually contextualize that domain APIs? The fourth one is that supervised AI side of things, right? Because we can't have any conversation these days without having the AI, and that supervised AI. So if you really look at those four as those transformational patterns that you could have today, each of these would have the right kind of KPIs that you should have, right? Because uh, it's probably foolhardy for us to say that let's focus on all this technology to get this right, because I'm sure pretty much all your listeners have actually heard this saying about technology is the simpler part. It's the people part that is difficult, and that's true, right? I mean, that's absolutely true. So what does that really mean, right? I mean, if you really try to break it down, to me it breaks down to something very simple, fundamentally so simple. Can I actually get the business value out of what I'm doing? So for each of those patterns I spoke about, the way to see the ROI is to see, like, how do I identify the actual business value for each of these things? So there are ways in which we can really say, here are the standard set of business value or the KPIs that you could look at. That's where things like space metrics and all those things would come in. And that would ensure that, hey, am I doing things right, and am I getting the value for it? So every time somebody says, yeah, platform engineering is not giving me what it's supposed to give you, the reason for that is that you probably didn't ask the developers what they want and didn't solve their problem. Just asking them isn't going to solve it, right? Developers might say, oh, I want to have faster deployment. Sure, I did something, it didn't make it faster. So what are those real metrics that you really look for? And that's the kind of ROI you should be looking for. So for each of these patterns, we should really come up with those KPIs to make sure that we measure that. But on top of it, you should also contextualize that. Just because I throw out like 25 different KPIs doesn't mean that for another person that's going to work, right? So every time I work with a client, I really sit down and talk to them really, like, what are their problems? Because how they actually approach a problem, the DNA of their organization is going to have a lot of impact on their KPIs, right? So that's how I would look at the whole ROI side of things.
Amazing. So there was a lot of things there to unpack as well. I think one thing which we wanted to discuss, I will probably go into, is like domain-driven platform engineering. You mentioned about it a little bit. So maybe first just start with explaining what does a domain mean here, right? Like kind of like it could be defined in many different ways. So what is a domain in the context of platform engineering?
Great question. So there are two axes at which we should look at this. So now I'll talk about the first axis and park that aside, and then we'll talk about DDP, right, or domain-driven platform engineering. The first concept of domains within platform engineering, this is the part that we are going into a lot of detail in the book that is already published, Effective Platform Engineering, is this idea of, like, what are the domains that ensure that your engineering platform is built right? So these are things like your customer identity, your security, your essentially your control plane side of things. Let's park that aside, right? Because that is fundamentally needed for your building your infrastructure based engineering platform. Now comes the idea of usability, or the user side of things. As a user, as a consumer of my engineering, or the engineering platform I provide, how do I actually interact with the system? Because as you're working in any kind of industries, you probably have some level of industry domain expertise. You are in a BFSI industry, or you might be in healthcare life sciences industry, you might be in a consumer industry, you might be in a telecom industry. So those are the traditional definitions of industry domains. And that is what we really mean by domain driven platform engineering. So how does that fit in? This is the part where we really need to sort of bring together two pieces that had never been like quite aligned together, right? Because that's the reason why in the old days we had this issue of people trying to write the code and then throwing things over the wall and say, hey, DevOps, guy, go build my stuff and deploy it for me, right? So we have tried to address that issue somewhat. I think things have improved, even though there are some organizations still struggling with that. So what if we were to provide that kind of API, that kind of capabilities for the developers, so that when they say that I want to actually deploy my payment gateway, deploy my healthcare pharmacy benefits management system or whatever, can it actually figure out what are the kind of engineering platform that needs to be built based on that? So trying to build that association between those two is the idea of domain driven platform theory. So think of it like your engineering platforms are sort of aligned with the business domains and using domain driven principles, the domain driven design principles. And where does the domain driven DDD principles come here? I think that's an interesting one, right? So one of the fundamental concepts in DDD for anybody who has, I'm sure a lot of architects listening to this, they're all familiar with this idea of bounded context. So bounded context is inherent to platform engineering, if you think about it, right? So if you think about the deployment management, everything that is related to deployment work, managing your deployment workloads, this could be things like your deployment orchestration, your GitOps reconciliation, could be your rollback, could be your audit trail, could be any of the things that goes into that. So that is sort of the context of the bounded context of platform engineering. So if you were to sort of tie these things, what you would find is that anything that you're really doing from your business domain point of view, if you're doing your payment gateway or something like that, those things should have a very specific set of bounded context within platform engineering for its deployment, for its experience, and for various activities you typically do that. So that's how these two things sort of come together. And that's the basic idea of DDP.
Interesting. So, if I understand correctly, you're saying is domain-driven platform engineering is more about like understanding the domain that the organization is operating in, and then kind of like building a platform for it.
Uh, you know, yes and no. So yes, in the sense that idea is always abstraction, right? So from the beginning of time, humans have struggled with what to abstract, what to hide, kind of thing, right? Or what should I expose, what should I hide, kind of thing. So that's always been a challenge. So this is, in my mind, a step in the positive direction to ensure that happens. So
Okay.
you're not really trying to build something that is or rebuild something that is already what we covered in the platform engineering side of things. Those things would still be true, but we are building something in between. So the kind of layers that you're building in between, the APIs that you're building in between your domain software and within your industry domain software and your engineering platform software, that is the core contents of domain-driven platform engineering. Because how does it help, right? Everything that is, that we have been talking about in the recent years, at least, right? All this idea of like reducing cognitive load, right? Because as a developer, I don't really need to know things, and now even if you say that, if you provide a platform, I'm sure the developers still have to learn things, right? That cognitive load is still high. We can measure it and make it look like it's all there and it's all perfectly working, but at the end of the day, it is still there. So that's why we call it reducing, right? We are not eliminating, right? So the other one is that faster innovation, which is absolutely true in this case, right? Because when you can spend less time trying to do certain things that you don't want to do, you can spend more time doing whatever you want to do, whether you take a vacation or you actually and recharge yourself or go build more products or get things out faster, whatever, right? And this also brings that other aspect, which has sort of kept some of the development communities away from this idea of platform engineering, this whole architectural focus, right? Because within architecture, we talk about, we already covered bounded context, we talk about things like event driven communication and those kinds of things, right? Those are the kind of things that becomes that middle piece there, which becomes that the enabler for the developers to really change their mindset with respect to how should I be using that capabilities. And seamlessly, eventually what will happen is that what I'm doing is I'm building my particular capability to be able to do certain things. What happens behind the scenes is the same engineering platform it's doing, what it's been doing so far. So that's that connection that you felt there.
Interesting. So you're talking about this is essentially a layer of infrastructure itself, or like libraries or systems that developers depend on because this is kind of related to the applications or the capabilities that these developers are building for their customers.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's where you find that as you really start shifting your abstraction a little bit more, and if you go layer by layer, if you think of it like, yeah, I mean, the underlying layer being your cloud infrastructure, something like that. Beyond that, what is that next level of APIs that you need, and maybe somebody's actually building an inventory management system. If you're doing an inventory management system, that could be used in multiple domains, right? And if you're
Mhm.
talking about a healthcare company, I used to help with the top, a Fortune 5 healthcare company. One of the things that they used to do was, they were really looking at problems from that inventory management point of view. But their inventory management problem has got a lot of parallels with a grocery chain's inventory management system and somebody else's inventory management. So there is a lot of activity. Then take something like a QMS. So anytime you really start looking at things at that level, you find that yes, there is an opportunity to see that you can keep moving your abstraction and ensure that that value is seen at the level in which you want it to see.
Very interesting. So, kind of like on the concept of abstraction, when the DevOps movement became big, right? Essentially, there was this concept of DevOps as a mindset. It's like, okay, every engineer needs to have a DevOps mindset and kind of like be collectively contributing to it. Do you think that the same thing also applies to platform engineering? And kind of like in some ways, can we expect every developer to be participating in platform engineering improvement? Like, I think part of the reason I'm also asking this is we talk about abstraction and standardization, which in some ways we're saying is we're going to hide the complexities from the developer. So, does that mean like the developer should not know about the platform or the complexities of the platform and only should focus on the things that actually delivers customer value?
Interesting question, right? So, we have been talking about the idea of high abstraction and low domain centricity, right? I mean, so with respect to everything that we do on this platform or the infra side of things. But different developers have different levels of interest in a lot of these kinds of things, right? So how much they dabble in it would have a lot to do with their interest level, but their understanding of what needs to be there has to be absolutely there. So some of the enablement work that I'm doing as part of Platformetrics is basically that. A lot of the people I'm talking to are the development teams, not the platform engineering teams. And I'm trying to get the platform engineering folks to understand, hey, what this is and all that. But a lot of my conversations, so some of the SVPs and CTOs sort of bring me in to actually have the conversation with their developers to make sure that they understand what they need to understand. They don't need to understand every nitty gritty, every details about it, but they do need to understand the concepts and why certain things are done certain ways. This also goes back to this idea. Again, we started this conversation with when we talked about golden paths versus golden cages, because that's one of the fundamental concern with experienced engineers who have been doing this for 15 years. And then you ask them, say, we're going to bring this new fancy platform around. You tell us what you need. They say, what I need is that you guys to go away. I got it, right? So, the question becomes like, can we actually educate the developers to see like what can they do to understand why we are doing it. Yes, the standardization and all that kind of good engineering principles, but go away from the engineering principles. Just talk about from a business outcomes point of view, right? Are you able to produce better software faster by doing something like this? And in some cases the solution is do nothing and let them do what they need to do. That's perfectly okay, right? But in order for the developers to make those decisions, they need to know something that's there. So that education is absolutely needed.
Interesting. Okay, so we're coming close to a little bit of time. So maybe at least a couple of things I want to cover. One is your opinions on AI. I mean, obviously, we can't do a podcast these days without talking about AI. What do you think are the implications of AI on platform engineering? Like one is, for instance, there's a lot more code being produced, and it puts more pressure even on your CI/CD systems and like all the other like developer tools that you're using. But at the same time, it also introduces this opportunity of like automating more things around platform, right? What is your take on the impact of AI on platform engineering?
So initially, the kind of conversation that we are having around AI in platform engineering, not AI as a whole, AI in platform engineering was a lot more hype than reality. But with the advent of more of the agentic approaches, I'm seeing there is some significant benefits that we can see. So you talked about code generation, right? classic problem. If you end up creating so much code, what are we actually going to do with that code, right? Not just the developers, because I have the same problem, and sometimes I use cloud to generate code, and then I'm like, like having my face palm moment. Right? Why did I do this? Because I ended up getting more code than I can even read, forget to understand. Once you have that, how do you actually handle that? And that's where the idea of what I call as a supervised AI comes in. I use the word supervised AI as opposed to human in the loop because in some cases it's a human in the loop. Some cases it might be those platform capabilities being the supervisor or the that human in the loop, right? So what are those cases? Um, so while I was at ThoughtWorks, we did some work, and after ThoughtWorks, I was the CTO of another company where we were actually building a bunch of these kinds of solutions from a services point of view. There are four fundamental areas from an operational or the delivery side of things that I see everybody and their uncles are building products, right? Which are like incident management, your SLO burn rates, and your operational efficiencies and policy drift, right? Like literally, those four areas are the significant investments that happening with agentic AI. Essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, hey, you got all these problems, let me categorize that for you. Once it's categorized, let me actually show you how to fix that. You have these problems in production, let me actually show you how to actually fix those drifts automatically, right? So there are things like that happening. So to me, those are commoditized already, right? Within a matter of months, it's been at the pace at which things are going is the biggest, the fear I have right now is people, every time they actually look at it, they feel like, oh my God, we have actually crossed the chasm. No, you haven't, right? It is still happening right in front of our eyes. But if you take those four things that I spoke about, those are things that everybody is commoditizing. Everybody is doing. I can claim that I can do it better than somebody else because maybe I can or maybe I can't, right? But where this actually platform engineering is really getting impacted is this idea of developers going from, the developer roles itself is sort of evolving if you think about it. Developers have historically been like people who are the owners, then they became the operators. Now they are becoming more of those supervisors, right? Your reactive activities are becoming more proactive. If you don't really now talk about, hey, am I talking to a developer versus an architect versus a PM? I'm talking about, am I talking about a junior developer versus a senior developer, right? I think there is that generic, going from the generic mode to that personalized mode kind of thing. So all those inferred activities that we used to do has become far more autonomous. And then comes the whole idea of guardrails, right? So I think this is where platform engineering has made a lot of, had its moment, right? By making sure that you set up the right kind of NFRs. Developers don't have to worry about it. Let the platforms worry about it. Now that is being driven by Copilot. So how do you actually take platform engineering to adopt these four activities to ensure that the changing developer roles are better understood? A couple of months back, we did a study and wrote a paper on this one. I'm happy to share the link. The state of AI in platform engineering, right? This was done by platformengineering.org. I helped write a paper for them. So one of the things that came out there was interesting. The data that we got there was very similar to the DORA reports and all that, where the dam has been broken, right? Like literally 9 out of 10 engineers today are using AI in their day-to-day work. It's no longer a question of like, hey, now should I be doing it versus not? And if you really look at where they're using it mostly, it's mostly for code generation. But we're also seeing situations where people are starting to wipe code their infrastructure, and that is a disaster waiting to happen. Right? If you think about it, right? If you're wipe code, you're asking, a completely non-deterministic system to actually go out and create your infrastructure, which is actually going to have significant impacts across the board in so many different places. So those are the kind of places where we need to go back to the basics, saying that
Hmm.
let's not start with your agentic automation. Let's not start with your fragmented infrastructure idea. Let's not start with this uncontrolled resource consumption activities. No, let's go back to this the four things that we were talking about earlier: the golden paths, your control planes, your domain APIs, and having a supervised AI. Once you have some of those things there, then bringing the ideas back in to enable the AI adoption becomes far more easier. So to sort of summarize it, I would say that make your engineering platform the foundation of AI, and that's
Hmm.
what the platform engineering's value is really going to be as we look ahead.
Amazing. All right, Ajay, I know we are close to time. So maybe one last question for you would be, do you want to share any of your work that is coming out? soon?
Absolutely. So we got a lot of work coming out. We recently released a couple of solutions. One on the platform ROI. So this is, I know we briefly talked about this earlier, right? I mean, how do organizations figure out the ROI? And sometimes the problem is that we try to make this highly quantified, and there's always this idea of objective versus subjective measurement of these things, right? So this is a model in which that's sort of coming together, bringing those two things together. Another thing that we've been doing is we have released the first version of sort of how do you actually determine this idea of what kind of portal should I be using, because this is the number one question I get every time I talk to somebody, right? Everybody wants to know, like, should I use Backstage or should I build something or do whatever? How do I make that determination? So we got some, it had some about 4 or 5 months of research going into it, and we came up with a solution. We're building on it. And there are multiple books also coming out from me. I mean, so I'm working on another book on platform engineering handbook, which really lets people getting into platform engineering space. And eventually, my hope is that platform engineering becomes a federated activity, right? You don't really always have a platform engineering team that is expanding with the organization, because organization sort of contributes into it because of that DDP concept and all that we talked about. And then the last thing is, yeah, we are writing another book on domain-driven platform engineering, and love for people to actually start looking at the early releases and give us some feedback.
Amazing. As your books go live, please share those with us. I will put that in the footnotes once they come out. And again, thank you so much, Ajay. This was a pleasure conversation. I really learned so much about platform engineering, and hopefully our audience did too. And thank you everyone for listening. If you're interested in developer experience or work in DevOps or DevX space, join us at HangarDX community. We run virtual sessions as well as podcast. In our virtual sessions, we invite speakers like Ajay and others to talk about like these topics with your peers. But until then, again, thank you, Ajay, so much for your time, and we'll hopefully see you again sometime.
Thanks, Uncle. Appreciate it.